Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Stanczyk, and I'm super excited to be here today talking to you all about Bletchley Park and some of the lessons that we can learn for modern intelligence programs. So a quick question for the group. How many of you have heard of Bletchley Park or somewhat familiar about the story? That's amazing. I'm so glad to hear that there's a lot of people here that know about it. How many of you have been there? Awesome. So a couple of you have been there. I'm sorry, I will not do this place justice in 20 minutes. So I definitely encourage you to read up about Bletchley Park. I'll give you a little bit of history today and some lessons and insights that I gained from being there. And then, anything that you can read or look up. And if you ever get the opportunity to go, definitely go. It's an amazing experience. It's, a place for me where, it was kind of like Disney for me. I stepped in and I was just like, this place is magic. Can I move in here? They said no, but still working on it. So a little bit about me. My name is Sierra, like I said. I'm a manager with PwC ThreatIntelligence, and I also serve as a strategic analyst for the group and the team's intelligence operations lead. I'm super honored to be here today to be representing this team. They're incredible, wonderful people to work with. And I even have one of my colleagues, Allison Wyckoff, here as well. She's our director for an America's lead for our team. And definitely come say hi to us, but super honored to be here today. So how did I get to Bletchley Park? Well, it was pretty simple. I flew to London and then went to London Euston Station and took a train to Bletchley Station and just kind of walked across the street. But it's actually a much longer story than that. So prior to joining PwC, I was with the FBI for 12 years. I started in the Directorate of Intelligence, and I was working on strategic planning and performance analysis for intelligence programs and initiatives across the enterprise FBI intelligence program. And then fast forward a few years, I became the intelligence program coordinator for FBI Philadelphia and got to see how leadership worked and development worked at a field office level with intel teams. And so from there, I did all sorts of leadership, tradecraft, development, requirements, and feedback, all sorts of stuff with FBI Philadelphia, and really loved it and just learned so much about how intel teams operate big and small across the enterprise with the intelligence community, with the private sector. So it was a really great experience. And then in November of 2021, I had the opportunity to join PwC ThreatIntelligence, and it has just been an amazing 15-month ride so far. I've learned so much from my team. If you've ever worked with us, this team is like truly stacked with some incredible people. So like I said, super honored to be here representing them. So like I said, joined PwC, and then last June, I met my team in London and we did an all hands meetup. So we're a global team. So this was like the big meetup where we all got to get together essentially for the first time as a team. And we were talking about all things threat intelligence and our vision for the future. And then as soon as I left that conference, I was super excited, steeped in all things intelligence and really energized. And then I went to Bletchley Park and was like, wow, it's all kind of coming together. All of my experiences in intelligence since 2009, I had all of these parallels and lessons, and this is what I really want to share with you today. So coming to Bletchley Park, this is where you'll arrive. This is the mansion. This is where a lot of cool things happened. It wasn't where everything happened, but this is just one of the really cool things to just come to Bletchley Park and get a sense of its history and everything that went on. And so some of the lessons that we'll be talking about today, I'll be kind of going through a little bit of background of Bletchley Park and then how it applies to modern day intelligence programs. So Bletchley Park is located about 42 miles outside of London, and it stood up in September 1939, basically to form the core operation of Britain's government code and cipher school. And so it was at Bletchley Park where a lot of things were happening, like the intelligence cycle, where collection was brought in from WWII stations located throughout the UK, as well as collection from diplomatic establishments and whatnot. But it was all processed here in Bletchley Park until 1946, after the end of World War II. And so just to kind of give you an appreciation of what they were dealing with, the level of radio communications that were being processed and integrated as part of military operations during World War II was something that, had not been seen before prior. There was a little bit in World War I, but the level that it was integrated, especially by Germany during World War II, brought a whole new era of signals intelligence into the game. And so Bletchley Park had a huge challenge ahead of itself of trying to make sense of all of these radio communications. And like I said, other collection like diplomatic chatter and whatnot. So they had to go through a lot of information and figure out a process for handling it. And so some of these, if you're familiar with the history, some of these were Morse code messages that were encoded with enigma machines that they would have to break daily codes, decrypt the messages, translate the messages, and then integrate them as part of the intelligence cycle process. And then you had longer form messages that were teletype transmissions that were encrypted, but by Lorenz machines. And so these are just a couple of examples. There's plenty of others, a lot of research of just the complexity of the collection coming in, even the complexity of getting the intercepts themselves. It was really an impressive effort. And so Bletchley Park was pulling all of this in, making sense of it, and then giving key high-value intelligence known as ultra intelligence to key stakeholders, one of which was Winston Churchill. He was a huge proponent of this program and a huge consumer of ultra intelligence. So take a moment to read this quote by Robert Hannigan. He was reflecting on Bletchley Park and what it would eventually turn into, which is the UK's Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ. So he's looking at this situation. He's looking at, reflecting on Bletchley Park and what it means now. Does this look familiar to anybody? Raise your hand if your organization is having similar challenges. Pretty much everyone. At the core of every intelligence program is trying to understand how best to sift through an ever-expanding world of information, make sense of it, turn it into something meaningful, especially when it's scattered, it's encrypted, it's incomplete, it's confusing, and then turning it into something useful to consumers. But here's the kicker: in a timely manner when they need it. So this quote really resonated with me. It kind of kicked off the book by Dr. David Kenyon. He's Bletchley Park's research historian. He wrote a fantastic book about D-Day and Bletchley Park's role in D-Day. So again, if you're interested, definitely check that book out. It's a fascinating story, and I regret I don't have enough time to share all of that, but it's amazing. So how did Bletchley Park do what they did at a high level? This should be somewhat familiar. So they would basically go and start with direction finding, figuratively and literally. They would look to see where they could collect information and how. And like I said, a lot of it was intercepts, there was other information, but direction finding was key. And then they would collect the information and then put specific intercepts through a registration process, which is where they essentially logged and triaged the information. And then the information that was sent to Bletchley Park went through traffic analysis, which was essentially metadata analysis, and then code breaking and decryption. So even when they collected it and they decrypted it, they then had to figure out what it meant. So they had to then translate the information, index it, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and then actually analyze the information in the traditional intelligence analysis sense that we think of, and then produce reports or any kind of mechanism that was appropriate to get it to the right person through dissemination. And here's, a plot twist: they would have to encrypt the information again before sending it out. So it was this, pervasive intelligence cycle at Bletchley Park to handle all of this information, with the stakes being very, very high. But I want to point out one thing and kind of talk about this more broadly. Instead of thinking about what happened at Bletchley Park as an intelligence cycle, I suggest we think about it as an intelligence system and something that has interdependent and interconnected components throughout, where it's not sequential and it's not necessarily cyclical in the sense of it's just going to continue on, but it's more of like a living, breathing system with a heart, with a network, with a memory, with constant communication and constant collaboration being a vital part of making this system work. And so if we distill it back down to the traditional intelligence stages that we're used to, this cycle looks a lot, or this system looks a lot like the intelligence cycle that we know with direction, collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination. So when we're starting with direction, we're talking about people having a common mission and common set of values. And that's something that Bletchley Park really had. They had a strong mission to be there, and they were bound by this common set of values. So that's just one of the key pieces that I wanted to point out and kind of put it back to the group as a question. You know, what do the values look like on your team, in your intelligence program? What is binding your team together? What are the values and what is the mission that is turning your group of colleagues into a cohesive team? At Bletchley Park, they had a lot at stake. They had a lot of challenges, but they had a lot of heart. And that powered a lot of their motivation and sense to the mission. They also had priorities and requirements that they shared extensively with everyone that they worked with. And so it wasn't a matter of having a list of requirements or a quarterly update on priorities. They were talking to each other in different roles to make sure that they knew what each other cared about and what information would come across their desk that other people needed to know. Because it wasn't as simple as seeing something cool on Twitter and then slacking it to a colleague and then putting it into a knowledge base and then searching it later. Like, none of that existed. So this really depended on people, even at an individual contributor level, really actioning priorities and requirements and sharing them pervasively and thinking about others. And having this mission and values and requirements all together, they had a lot of care for each other and recognition that they were dependent on each other to be successful. And so you had this communal nature within these teams at Bletchley Park, where if they weren't physically located near each other, they went out of their way to connect physically, to really have those conversations, even if it meant crossing long distances. And so as an example, we had collectors in the WWII stations who would bring in analysts and code breakers from Bletchley Park. And remember, the WWII stations were located throughout the United Kingdom. And they would have these meetups and talk about priorities and requirements and different lines of intercepts. And they would refine their prioritization based on that collaboration and those discussions. And without that, really, Bletchley Park wouldn't have been able to prioritize and process collection the way that they needed to. As you can imagine, the 1940s, they were collecting a lot of information, but there was a lot of backlog, and they had to make decisions about what they were going to put through this system and what they were going to leave on the cutting room floor of the WWII stations. So it's just fascinating to think about and have an appreciation for how much they collaborated and shared these priorities and conversations so frequently and made it a part of their daily work. They also, talking about a lot of collection, they also powered through information overload by having this intelligence factory mindset. And they basically knew that even with all of the collection coming in, if one person didn't do their job and stalled the system, it meant that the system would eventually break down. So they knew that they had to keep information moving. They need to do their job effectively because other people depended on them. And they really needed to power through and make tough calls and tough decisions when they were getting through this information overload. So one of the questions that I have for you all, within your organization, how often are you talking about priorities and requirements? And as an analyst, are you thinking about those and refining them to a level where you're having conversations with your colleagues about what's important to their work and how that fits in with the broader priorities of your organization? And one thing that I found really interesting about all of this was that you would have so many different roles, and we'll kind of talk about the different roles at Bletchley Park, but they were still communicating with each other, even if they didn't know exactly what each other did. And so for me, I think about that, and I think about Intel teams and think, as individual researchers and analysts, are you having conversations with a diverse set of coworkers on your team? Or are you kind of clinging to people where you know them well, or you know their research or roles well? And I would just challenge that you really expand your scope of who you're reaching out to on your teams and really learn about what other people are doing on your team, even if you don't really know much about the role or you don't see the connections, because you'll find that when you're really reaching out to your team and having that diverse perspective in conversations, you'll see how interconnected and interdependent your teams are. And so when we move on to collection, I know I talked a little bit about collection, what was collected. So I'm going to talk about who was influencing and using the collection at Bletchley Park. So one thing that I think really stood out to me as part of my research and in the visits was just the presence of women in Bletchley Park. At its highest staffing levels, more than half of the staff at Bletchley Park was made up of women. And this was both in the service and civilian capacities. So it's just really neat to see the types of roles that they were in and how much they really powered Bletchley Park. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple other roles that a lot of them held, but one of the groups was the Women's Royal Naval Service, or WRENS. They were staffed in a lot of the WWII stations throughout the United Kingdom doing the collection, but they were also riding these motorcycles and bicycles, and they were dispatch riders sharing intercepts with different locations, including Bletchley Park, throughout the war. So they were physically taking the intercepts and driving them to where they needed to go. So they were really hardcore, they were really awesome, and it's just a fascinating thing to see, especially at Bletchley Park. And if you've ever driven around the UK, and you can imagine like the 1940s and the rain and the mud and the war and intercepts, it's just very, very humbling. So a few other roles. I apologize for the angle of this photo. There was a group of school children that I was trying to maneuver around. But these are some of the roles at Bletchley Park, if it's hard to see, but just take a look. There's like a bunch of different roles that you're like, I wonder what that is. And I'm just gonna go ahead and get this like out of the way. I know there's a role on there where you're like, I don't know what that is or what it had to do with the war. Does anyone see what I see? Meteorologist, right? It was the other one. Yeah, definitely meteorologist. That was the one that was a little weird. So what a meteorologist, by the way, I looked it up so you don't have to. Meteorologists were actually reading the intercepts about enemy forecasts, which were coming through a lot on certain lines. And these were actually key to a lot of the code breaking activities because the forecasts were in some senses formulaic and repetitive. So it was a good way to start building cribs and start thinking about different ways to break the daily code. So meteorologists were definitely key with helping out with that, but also really reading the intercepts and understanding enemy, understanding weather conditions in enemy territories. But at the end of the day, every role had a piece of the puzzle. And so like I said earlier, there was trust that people would get the job done because others were depending on them. And you can see how diverse all of the roles were and what kind of help that they needed and roles that they needed as part of this. So as they were building out their collection, building out the roles, building out the processes, one thing that I really appreciated was their ability to expand the organization physically by building more huts and warehouses, but also maintaining a fluid structure of organization and being able to recalibrate the organization and co-locate related groups and interdependent groups without it being like a huge bureaucratic thing. They really streamlined it so that it would be a functional, growing organization. And this is in contrast to when it was like really first firing up in 1939 and 1940. It was more of an incubator-like construct where they were experimenting and they were trying different things. And then over, a period of a couple of years, they really had to transform it into this production-like facility. Also with like production-like facility conditions, if you can imagine, in the 1940s. But they essentially went from, less than 100 people to 9,000 in a very short period of time. And one of the biggest takeaways for me as an intelligence, program nerd is, wow, like they were able to do this. They were able to give their analysts and their different job roles options without having to they didn't have time to throw away the whole playbook and start over and do all of these crazy reorgs. They kind of adjusted as they went and streamlined organizations as they went along. So I would definitely challenge you, if your organization has an Intel program, think about that. Bletchley Park could do it within a couple of years and 9,000 people. Please stop the dreaded reorg. And please think about having a more fluid and dynamic organizational structure for your teams so that they can, recalibrate their skills on their own and move and migrate as needed and as the mission's needed. So that was one of the biggest takeaways for me. But essentially with this growth, they knew that the encryption was going to evolve. And so these daily code changes and the methods with the enigma machines and other machines, they were preparing for a future state. And that was so important to their success. They saw, they envisioned what was coming down the years and what they would need to do. And they started building toward it. And they knew that the intercepts were going to increase in volume, and they started building toward that. And so while they were evolving their structure, but having this fluid dynamic, they were still pushing those same, general concepts of trust, independence and accountability, but individual autonomy, and making sure that you as an analyst or researcher, indexer, librarian, whatever role that you had in Bletchley Park, you may not have been able to see the bigger picture, but you knew that people depended on you and you depended on other people as well. And so that just kept the system moving and kept the system going, especially during really difficult times. So if we get to processing, I know when we talk about the intelligence cycle, the processing phase can really be confusing for people. And so I think in this context, the best way to talk about processing is turning what was collected into something that's manageable for the organization to figure out how best to handle it and to increase the potential that the information will be viewed by the right people at the right time. And so the way that Bletchley Park did this was through knowledge management. It was such a critical component of Bletchley Park. And if you can imagine, again, no computers here. In fact, the first electronic computer was developed at Bletchley Park named Colossus, but it wasn't, something that they could necessarily like Google search different terms and then put analysis together and assessments together based on what they collected. Like none of that was available. And so they use these guys, index cards, millions of them. And index cards mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I know like flashcards for students and for human collectors, it's, a definite go-to for them. But these index cards formed the indices of Bletchley Park. And so any information that was coming through when it was collected, prioritized, decrypted, translated, and then analyzed, it was also indexed. And that was a painstaking clerical process where you would have librarians and indexers basically sorting through all of these data points, putting them on index cards, color coding them, grouping them together, and then making them available through querying so that analysts or other roles could come to the librarians and say, do you have more information about this piece of enemy equipment? Or do you have more information about this call sign? That hinged on librarians and indexers and having a knowledge base that was searchable and that was dynamic for Bletchley Park. Super impressive. They had all sorts of mechanics behind it to make it work and make it fast, but they would essentially be able to recall information from days ago or years ago, especially if it was incomplete or not necessarily relevant. They had this process and they maintained this knowledge base to help with their analysis and help with their operations moving forward. And so this really developed the memory and neural network of Bletchley Park, and just a very fascinating case study in knowledge management and just how much collection that was coming into Bletchley Park and what they were able to do with it was super impressive. So I would definitely challenge this audience, like, what does that neural network look like for your organization? Do you have institutional and individual expertise that you're collating together, probably virtually with a collaboration tool? Like, we have such an incredible opportunity to use those. But what does that look like as part of your organization? Is it something that is prioritized and is valued in your organization? And what are your analysts and other roles doing to contribute to that knowledge base regularly and keep it alive and keep it relevant and keep it in use for future iterations of your organization? So moving on to analysis, they were basically able to query the neural network, the knowledge base, and facilitate analytic processes by bringing different groups of people together, whether they were different services, military branches, agencies, even countries. They were able to bring these people together and conduct critical thinking and collaboration using this neural network and using this emphasis of trust and diversity and keeping things moving in the intelligence system. And in some cases, they really broke down bureaucratic silos. One example of this was WWII was a group of intelligence analysts. They basically owned the analytic process, and they were basically entitled and empowered to be the stewards of high value intelligence. So even if something came in through one interception line or another piece of collection, they could make decisions on who this was disseminated to, even if it wasn't if the relevance wasn't apparent at face value. So they were entrusted with owning the process and knowing who would benefit and having the flexibility to make sure that they got that information. And as you can imagine, there were groups that were protective over certain sources of collection, and they wanted to dictate this process. And WWII had to fight to have this broad authority and to be trusted with making these dissemination decisions. And they were able to do this and do it well. And it definitely served Bletchley Park and the Allied forces well for giving them that type of authority. So definitely a lesson in having trust in your analysts and having trust that they will be responsible with collection and analysis and that they will make the right decisions about dissemination. So definitely encourage with your intelligence programs to trust the analysts, trust the analytic process, and learn from them and really engage them in decision making so that information is going to the right people regardless of where it came from. And so the final stage is dissemination. I know that we talked a lot about dissemination today in the earlier conversations. What I really took away from Bletchley Park was that dissemination and feedback were pervasive throughout Bletchley Park and its partner agencies and the countries that they worked with. It was just a constant stream of information where they were relaying, short form intelligence notifications or longer form intelligence assessments to various stakeholders. They knew their audience, but they were constantly refining priorities and feedback based on these conversations. And in some cases, this feedback in these conversations were so critical that they were channeling direct lines of communications to specific teams in Bletchley Park to their their counterparts in other countries and other intelligence agencies. So 1940s, this was like, a big deal having this level of communication. And one of the interesting points is they knew their audience, they knew their stakeholders. Winston Churchill, like I said, was a huge consumer of ultra intelligence. He wanted ultra intelligence with him every morning when he was waking up. He wanted to read some of the intercepts. He wanted to read the reporting. And so that they took that opportunity to send him some of the juicier intercepts that were coming through. But like I said, the D-Day story by Dr. David Kenyon, there's a really, really powerful story about how Bletchley Park and collection, analysis, and dissemination influenced that. So definitely encourage that story. So when we're talking about an intelligence system, how can we really start looking at our program like a system itself and less like a cycle? And one way is when you're looking at a system, you're monitoring the vital signs. And so these are some questions that you can ask if your program is functioning healthily and if your intelligence program is operating like a system. And that's mainly, are you seeing your analysts actively engaged in your mission? Are your team members invested in the success of their group, but also in each other's success? Are they cheering each other on? Are they showing up? Are they alerting management and leadership when the vital signs are a little off, when something feels off in the group? Each individual on your team has a unique perspective that they might be able to find something early on when something is amiss in your intelligence system that maybe you may not have picked up on right away. And here are a few more questions that you can ask. I know we've talked a lot about burnout in the industry. Is your team looking at each other and making sure that your employees know about burnout and that they're not experiencing it, or if they are, how the group can rally behind them? Another big thing is, how is your organization defining success and impact, and how at an individual level are you tracking that as well? If you've heard from John's discussion earlier, ways that you can track that throughout the year and not just during annual performance season. But these are all things that you can do to track the vitals of your intelligence system and intelligence program. So covered a lot of ground today. I hope that these key lessons and just vignettes from Bletchley Park offer a little bit of insight into breaking the enigma of your intelligence program, looking at it more as a system rather than a cycle, talking about shared values and priorities and having trust, talking about using diverse skill sets, building diverse roles, and having a fluid structure and not relying on reorgs and huge disruptions. Building out that neural network and the knowledge base of your team. What does that look like? How can you use technology to empower it? And is all of your team engaged in that knowledge base? And then analysis and dissemination, empowering your analysts, giving them options, talking about feedback and recalibration, and then monitoring the vital signs, not just as a manager, but as any kind of team member within the program, keeping a pulse check on the health of your program and making sure that if something's amiss, that you're promoting a culture of openness and that you're enabling anyone within your team to come and alert when there's something going very, very well within your intelligence program, or if there might be a part of the system that's like breaking down or having issues. But yeah, that is my presentation today, talking about Bletchley Park. I know I'm running out the clock, so thank you all very, very much.